In between the lines, there's a lot of obscurity. I'm not a man to deny my maturity. When it's alright, when it's all wrong, why dance around to the same damn song? Used to run when you can't swim. I know, you know that I ain't telling the truth. I know, you know that I got nothing to prove. Embrace the deception. Learn how to bend. Worst intuitions, and we psych you out in the end. Hey guys, welcome back to Movies and TV Shows on the Ball. My name is Steve, your host, and as you can tell by my voice, I'm a little bit under the weather, but I decided just to give you guys kind of a little bit of a Jay and I will be back for doing Zorro and John Wick soon. So this episode will just sort of kind of be something that is kind of in between this episode, that episode, and this, or our previous episode and this. And one of the shows I wanted to cover was on PSYCH, which is on streaming on Amazon Prime. And I kind of wanted to, and I kind of, was a kind of big fan of this show. This show came out on the USA Network in the year 2006. This was during the time when USA Network was kind of trying to find its sort of original programming scheduling, and at that time, that was when you had shows like Burn Notice, which was about a spy who got burnt, and then you had the shows like Monk with Tony Shalhoub, and I think they had a show called Royal Brains about a doctor who lives in the Hamptons and solves medical crimes. House MD they showed reruns of House MD on on USA Network, just to kind of show, because I guess Universal owned the rights to House, and I guess they rented them out to the Fox network. But Psych was one of those shows that really kind of came on the scene, and I think really stuck. I mean, the show itself lasted from 2006 to 2000. In between the lines, there's a lot. So it ran from 2006 to 2014, which lasted about 121 episodes and 8 seasons. And it got popular enough that it actually was followed by 3 made-for-TV movies: Psych, the movie, and then Psych 2 and Psych 3. Psych, the movie came out in the year in 2017. Psych 2 ended up coming out in 2020, and Psych 3 came out in 2021. So Psych was created by Steve Franks. Steve Franks is best known for writing the screenplay for Big Daddy. He wrote for the he was executive producer for the Cancel Too Soon TV series based on the Jackie Chan Chris Tucker movie Rush Hour, and he was also producer and he's pretty much done nothing but Psych since. But having a show from 2007 to 2014 can really take some of its time. Other writers were James Rhodey Rodriguez, which we'll get into in a second. The show starred James Rhodey Rodriguez, who plays Sean Spencer, and he was in films such as The Dukes of Hazzard with Jessica Simpson. He was in Gamer with Gerard Butler. His other works include he actually showed up for a special in WWE Raw He was in Beer Fest, Mrs. March. He was with Eddie Murphy and uh, Robert De Niro in Showtime, and he was also in his other work. He was in a television series that lasted a canceled 2-season series that lasted one season called Get Real with Sean Tinnery and Eric Christian Olsen. Um, he plays Sean Spencer. And then you have Dule Hill, who played Burton Guster. Dule Hill is best known for his roles as Charlie Young in The West Wing. I noticed him as the best friend of or side friend of Paul Walker in She's All That, where he played. Um, I think he played Preston. He also was featured in the Jamie Foxx show episodes of Smart Guy. Um, you've seen him in films such as Holes, and he was in The West Wing and The Guardian, to name a few. He's recently been in. He was in Doubt with Katherine Heigl for the canceled 2-season series Doubt. Um, he was in Ballas with The Rock. And recently he was in. He's been Bill Williams in the ABC television series remake of The Wonder Years. So that's where he's been into. His upcoming project is Robo Gobo which is a animated television show about pets. So anyway, that's where Dule Hill from. He plays Burton Guster. And then you had Timothy Almerson as Carlton Lester. Timothy Almerson was an IMF agent in Mission Impossible 3. He was a psychic in Starship Troopers. And he was also in episodes of Judging. He was a regular in Judging Amy. He's been in. He was in the Woody Woodpecker movie, which I guess he just did that for a paycheck. He was in the television series Angie Tribeca. He did voice work for Star Wars, The Old Republic, Night of the Eternal Throne. His other works include Hot in Cleveland. He did voice work for Star Wars: The Force Unleashed 2 and Star Wars: The Force Unleashed. He was in episodes of Without a Trace, Boston Legal. He was on episodes of CSI and 24, to name a few. He was also the Deputy District Attorney in the OC, which we will be getting to soon, which I'm going to be covering one day. He was also in episodes of Nip Tuck, and he was in the film Swordfish and Luck of the Irish, the Disney Channel original movie about a boy finding out that he's a leprechaun. So he plays Carlton Laster, and Carlton Laster is like the big head guy, not the head guy of police, but the rookie, kind of not the rookie cop, but the cop, head cop guy. Then you had Maggie Lawson, who plays Juliet O'Hara. Maggie Lawson was in films such as Gamer. She was in Pleasantville in 1998. She was in episodes of Lethal Weapon. Which after PSYCH left, she was on episodes of Lethal Weapon. She's done a lot of Hallmark films, including The Story of Us with Sam Page for Hallmark. She's done the Hallmark movie My Favorite Wedding. And she's been in True Calling. She was in an episode of Smallville. Episodes of Party of Five. Episodes of ER, Felicity, and Home Improvement and Boy Meets World. So that's her. She plays Juliet O'Hara, who is a partner of Carlton Laster. And then rounding out the cast, you had Corbin Bellstrom. Corbin Bellstrom is best known for films such as Major League and Major League 2, back in the minors. He was in Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. He was in Magnum PI, the new show. He was in, let's see, Swell. His early works include, he was in Pizza Man with Frankie Muniz, episodes of Castle. He was in the New Adventures of Ultrastreen, episodes of that. Depth Charge. He's been in episodes of Boston Legal, Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, episodes of Jag, episodes of LA Law, and VIP with Pamela Anderson. He also directed films such as Christian Mingle the Movie with Lacey Chabert, Life with Dog, and Mary for Mayor. His other works include The Miracle Watch. So he's done a lot. It's interesting. He's done a lot of really kind of interesting, like you kind of, hey, I'd seen that guy somewhere, kind of thing. I kind of knew of him, but this is where I know him as Corbin Bellstrom. I knew him as Henry Spencer, who is Sean Spencer's father. Then you had Maggie Lawson. Oh, no, I already did there. Then you had Kristen Nelson. Kristen Nelson is best known for her work in PSYCH. She plays the Captain Karen Vick. In this, her other works include The Fugitive with Harrison Ford in 1993. She was in War of the Worlds with Tom Cruise and Steven Spielberg. Her other roles include she was in the West Wing with Dule Hill, and she was also in an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which we covered. She was also Jessica in Boy Meets World. But she didn't show up till season 6. She was in, but The Fugitive was her first role. But after Psych, she's been in Bluff City Law with Jimmy Smith, who played Senator Bell Organa in the Star Wars movies. So that's she. Since she plays the captain of the police force. Then you had Sage. Sage Burbank, who plays Buzz McNabb. He was in films such as The Predator. He was in Supergirl. And he's done works such as Heavenly Match for Up. He was in an episode of Almost Human with Almost Human. He was a desk guard in Arrow. He's done a lot of little work in movies. He was Sir Gaston in an episode of Once Upon a Time, and he played James in an episode of Smallville. So, he's kind of done a lot of little work and things like that. Uh, then you had, then rounding out the cast, you had Kurt Fuller, who was the coroner officer. He was in, you probably know him as uh, Hattermeyer, who was trying to get the Ghostbusters out of Ghostbusting in Ghostbusters 2. He played Frank Head in Anger Management. He was in films such as Law and Order SVU, episodes of American Dad, episodes of The Good Wife, episodes of Bones, Hot in Cleveland, The Crazy Ones with Robin Williams, Frozen Ground with Nick Cage, and Midnight in Paris, to name a few. So that's pretty much the cast. And the show pretty much starts out with the show pretty much centers around Sean, who's a psychic detective who basically goes around and claims that he's a psychic, and it's sort of like, how long can this facade last? So we're gonna go in through the episode and I'll give you my thoughts. Is that I think what they do is they really make it into kind of a mini movie than it is. They take the pilot into movie, which a lot of pilots do. Is they'll take two episodes and bring them into two pilot episodes of a show, and they'll kind of connect them together and make them into one movie. And that's what they kind of did with this psych episode. So what we see at the beginning of the episode is the Universal logo, and then we're kicked into the year 19, I think 85 or 86, somewhere around there. And the episode opens up with young Sean, played by Josh Hayden, who you know from Painkiller Jane, Fetching Cody, and Fetching Cody and others. Anyway, he's sitting at the diner with his dad, played by Corbin Preston, and they're actually they're kind of just finishing up a meal, and young Sean asks for his dad if he can have the fudge cake, and he's like, "Have you finished your dinner, your lunch?" And he's like, "Well, no, not yet." And he said, and then Henry basically says, "Why don't you close your eyes?" And he's like, "Dad, I don't want to close my eyes and do this." He says, "Come on, son, close your eyes." And then he asks his son, how many caps does he see in the room are there? And this is kind of a moment where we get to see kind of the way Sean's psychic ability works. He says there's, two caps, on the three men sitting at the diner bar. There's one cap that is in his pocket, and another cap is in the room. And then he asks, what's the. Then Henry tests him on what letter is out on the light, and he says is burned out on the exit sign, and he says the X, and he says, what's the color of the seats that we're sitting on, and he says maroon. And he says, what's the waitress's name? And he asks who the waitress is, and the waitress' name is Marie. And what's really kind of fascinating is that when Sean kind of does his psychic ability, which we'll see numerous times throughout the series, is that everything, there'll be kind of a sound going doo 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 doo, and you'll see like images light up. Kind of this sort of shows us his sort of psychic ability, kind of how his psychic ability works. And he says, how many hats are how hats are in the room. What's the name of our waitress? Like I said, and so basically he tells them that there's four things that he sees psychically, and then he then Henry basically says, "Okay, get him his cake," and we see sort of the waitress say, "Well, I know what you're gonna be when you grow up," and Sean says basically, "Oh, ma'am, I'm never gonna grow up." And then cut to the present, which is 2006, and Sean is just gone out on a date with the waitress, known as I think she goes by the waitress, by waitress, and the actress' name is Ingrid Tesch. She was in films such as Wrongfully Accused with Leslie Nielsen, Cats and Dogs 2 as Mom, and MVP Most Valuable Primate. Her primate about the monkey that plays hockey. She was also in films such as she was in the episodes of Battlestar Galactica Razor. She was in Tin Man. She was in episodes of The Elwood. And recently she was in the Autumn in the City, a TV movie, which I guess was on like UPN or something. She was in Air Buddies, and she was in Nightman, as well as the Leslie Nielsen film Wrongfully Accused, and the remake TV movie of Harvey with Harry Anderson, excuse me. Anyway, so that's the waitress that. So anyway, we kind of cut to 2000. We go up to the present day, where Sean is making out with a girl, waitress who is played by Carrie Lynn Pratt, who is credited as hot waitress in the credits on IMDb. She was in American Sweethearts in 2001. She was in the Britney Spears theme song "Drive Me Crazy" with Melissa Joan Hart. She was in episodes of Smallville. She played Cat Grant, which was at the ending. Her other roles include one episode of Veronica Mars, episodes of CSI. She played in House MD, and an episode of Law and Order SVU. She was also in the Fat Albert movie with Kenan Thompson, to name a few. She was also in that 70s show and Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Okay, but she's kind of got an uncredited. So she's the waitress, and she's making out. She and Sean are making out, and Sean and they're kind of getting hot and heavy, and as they're making out, Sean turns on the TV and is watching the newscast, and he sees the news guy giving a report or giving an interview about a bunch of, I guess it was electronic store robberies that were going around in the neighborhood, and he kind of notices through his psychic gift that one of the men that is talking to the reporter is fidgeting with his hands, and and so he gets this idea to call up the police department and to give him a hint for a reward, or hint for a that the owner did the robbery, as is the robberies. And so he kind of says, to her that to his date, that he solved the case. He hangs up, and then the next day he drives, and then we get the PSYCH logo. And then the next day on his motorcycle, he drives in to the police station to get his reward. And he goes over to the the desk sergeant, played by Patricia Idelita, who was in Scary Movie 3, Dead Like Me, Chaos Theory, and She's the Man. She played the science teacher, and She's the Man. So she basically, tells him, she gets on the phone, tells him, motions for him to sit down. So he sits down next to this guy who is basically in handcuffs, and he's sitting there, and Sean, sort of, using his psychic ability, sees that that he has been looking at, what's her name, kind of looking at him, and looking at the guy in handcuffs that's up for parole. He is up for kind of going into getting booked, I guess, is where I'm going with this. And he sees like red taillight pieces on the suspect's shirt, and he tells him, and he asks them, and Sean asks the taillight guy, who is played by Mark Arction, who is best known for Elf. He played the mailroom guy, who he and Buddy the Elf are lying on the or in the mailroom, and he says, "Oh, syrup and coffee! I've never seen that." And they get drunk and or get buzzed, and they lie on the thing, and says, they talk about how they're, it's that scene where they're sitting there and they're lying on the thing. It's like, my papa, he made Master Tinker back in it took him 200 years to make Master Tinker, and that kind of thing. So anyway, he's sitting there, and so Sean tells him, what'd you do? Bust up your girlfriend's car, because he notices the shattenings of red taillight glass, and he says no, her new boyfriend's, and he says, you probably might need to rub off the tail lights, the pieces of broken tail lights off your shirt. He's like, thanks, man. So then we're introduced to both Carlton and Officer Lassity and Officer Barry. Now, Carlton Lassiter was played by Timothy Olyphant, who I've mentioned during the cast. But then he has a partner who they pretty much only used for the pilot, named called Lucinda Barry, who's played by Annie Dudick. She was in shows such as Mad Men, and she was one of the Hilton S sisters, Tiffany Wilson, in the White Chicks movie. But where I know her most from, she was in, I think, season 5 to season 9 of House. She played Dr. Amber Volix in House MD. She's recently been in The Good Doctor and episodes of The Flash, to name a few. But anyways, and she only shows up in this pilot. I don't think she shows up in a show after that. But anyway, she is Lassiter's partner, and so they back in Lassiter, or they back in Sean into the interrogation room, and Sean's like, "Okay, here I am. When do I get my reward?" And she's like, "Your reward?" Is like, "Yeah, like some reward money." And Sean says, or Lassiter says, the well, we'll talk about that once you give up your partner. And he's like, "I gotta find him." And he's like, "So there were two." And Lassiter says, "Yeah, there were two guys." And he says, "But I didn't do it." And he says, "Oh, we know you didn't do it, but we also know." And he talks to him, and Lassiter basically, they pull out a file on Sean, and Lassiter basically says, "So whatever happened to the the Grand Theft Auto you happened to do?" And he's like, "Look," and this Sean says, "Look, I was 17 when I did it. I was trying to impress a girl, and the officer that arrested me was my father and he arrested me to teach me a lesson." And Lassiter says, "Well, did you learn it?" He says, "Yes, I learned it, not that I hated my father." And so basically, Lassiter says, "Come on, guys, I know my rights." And he says, "Well, then if you know your rights, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you can say." And so they try to basically, Lassiter tries to pin the stereo robberies on Sean. And then, and Sean's like, as he's talking to him, he gets the desk sergeant and officer. Let's see, Officer McNabb, played by Sage Brockbank, who was in The Predator and Alien Trespass, and he's recently been in Peacemaker, to arrest Sean for basically trying to lie to the police. And as they're arresting him, we see that Sean has kind of a vision, and he basically says that he notices, like, the since he kind of noticed the Dreamcatcher earrings that the desk sergeant wore. He starts to say, your grandmother would have been so proud. And she's like, "Oh, you spoke to her?" And he's like, yes, I did." And then he says to uh, uh, Captain, or to Officer McNabb, "I see 1, 2, 3." He says, starts going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I'm getting um, I'm getting dance lessons. When's the wedding? And he says, "In May." It's like, wow, he's good. And he kind of shows his psychic ability that usually gets him kind of out of the hot water. And as he's walking back, we kind of get into the first case of the week, or the basically case of the episode, excuse me. So he's walking out, and as he's walking out of the police station, Karen, I think her name's Karen Vick, basically, who's the chief, intercom chief, says, "I saw what you did in there. you know, and he's like, and we basically need your help because there's been a kidnapping. And then Sean's like, look, I had nothing to do with the kidnapping. And so she's like, well, do you want to? And he says, okay, I will. And, but my fee is like, $500. And, what they say, or, some sort of amount of money. And she's like, now we'll discuss your fee later. I, uh, have you heard of the McCallums? And Eddie says, yeah, they're like the richest family in town. He says, well, she's like, well, there's been a kidnapping, and we need you to, um, like you to be part of the case. And he kind of says, here, then it says, you know what, there'll be a flat fee for you if you help us out. So then we get into going into the house of the of well, actually, we go into introduction of Gus, played by Dule Hill. So Sean goes to Gus's office. Gus is working for a pharmaceutical company where he basically does and tries, basically tests out drugs and sort of for pharmacies and stuff like that. And we'll get more into that as the series goes on. But he's like, he knocks on the door, knocks on Gus's door, and says, "Hey, I got a great case. I got a great job for you." And he's like, "Sean, you've since we've left high school, you've had like 150 different part-time jobs, from like acupuncture specialist to um, cleaning specialist, or not cleaning, to working here and there." And he says those were all good jobs. Some of them were fun, but I think we've hit the kit of the litter. We've always wanted to start our own psychic company, our own detective agency. Now's our chance. He's like, and Bert and Gus is like, so what do you mean? And he says, look, I told the police that I am a psychic, and now we've got a case. Isn't that great? And he says, and so we kind of can see where, as an audience, we understand that this is where Gus and Sean are best friends, and how their relationship is. And then we also get to see that this is how Gus kind of gets roped into the series. So then what happens is Gus, so he says, so he says, I have Sean basically tells Gus, I have a job for you. And Gus basically says, Sean, since we left high school, you have more than like 48 or like 148 different jobs. And he says, what happened? What about the acupuncture job and the candy store job and this job and that job? And he says, those were all fun. Those were all good. Those were all fun. But I think we found, and Sean's basically saying, like, look, I think we found our calling. One thing I like what they did is, or what Sean does is when he comes in and says, when Sean comes in and talks to Gus, he tells Gus, like, I found my, once he kind of gives him the news, he says, or Gus says, look, Sean, I'm working. He says, yeah, I know, but you're really just playing Space Invaders, because I can see your hand is on the left and right arrow key, and your right left hand's on the S and the Z and the space bar. And he says, how do you know that? And he quits his game. So that's kind of a funny thing, that he kind of still uses his psychic ability, not just to solve crime. But so anyway, so Gus says that I've already had a job, and tells him that it's what, so you can play video games. It's like, what do you mean? He's like, how do you know that? He's like, oh, come on, Sean, or come on, Gus. I know that your hands are on the space bar and M key, I know that you're playing on arrow left arrow key, playing Space Invaders, and then he quits the he quits the game, and he ends up um, he ends up saying, Sean, so what brings you into my office? And he says, Gus, I have a proposition for you. We've got a job. And Gus is like, look, since we left high school, you've had more than 15 or 17 jobs, somewhere around there. The last job you had was an acupuncture. It's like, those were all fun acupuncture job, and the other one you were a clown or something like that. And he says, those were all great jobs. Some of them were fun, but I've got the one that takes the cake. And he says, and Gus is like, okay, then what is it? And he says, and Sean is like, we're starting our own psychic detective agency, like the one we've always wanted. And he says, look, the police already know that I'm a psychic, and just, you can come in and just help me anytime that I am, like, I get kind of foggy. You know how I kind of end up rambling and kind of get in my own space. And Sean sort of agree, and he says, look, or Sean basically says, look, we just got a case. It's and he basically tells him about the case of the week, about that the son's kidnapping that evolved in the McCollum's house. And so he says, come on, just come with me and help me out when I just kind of get foggy and stuff. So they end up going down to the McCollum's residence. As they're on their way to the McCollum's residence, Sean basically kind of updates Gus on what's going on with the Sean's kind of telling what's going on with the they go talking about what's with the case, and how basically the ins and outs of the case, that basically says that uh, about how the son's missing, and how he rented how he spent the time at his son's cigarette boat, and his father's cigarette boat, and how he ran it into the aquarium, and basically kind of his son's criminal charges have Mr. McCollum's son's criminal charges have been. So head to the McCollum's estate, and the first thing Gus and Sean do is goes through their garbage, and Sean just to kind of look for clues. Sean finds a what I love about this is Sean looks through the clues and says, "Hey, we found something. This CD case is really nice." Totally nice. And he asks him why kind of, I love how, and what makes it great is how Sean basically can look at a, sort of like, they're, in the ways of the lyrics of this says, on the theme song, I'm not in line to deny my maturity. We kind of do see Sean do, kind of is a little, kind of will break out of being a detective and doing some immature things, like just looking at a CD case. And then we see they head uh, into the house, and they see both Officer Barry and Carl and Officer Lassender uh, are going through the kind of doing their investigation, and Sean and Gus start talking about, can you basically fool them into believing that you're still considered a psychic. And he says the only way that I can show him that I'm not a psychic is if I tell him that I'm not a psychic. So Sean gets distracted and starts to look at a painting that is on the wall in another room, and the painting is a portrait of the McCollum family, and he looks kind of, and what catches his eye is the portrait the um, of the daughter Cinda Berry in the family portrait. That basically she says, look at her, and he kind of awes and gazes at her, and he says, he starts to kind of almost flirt with her, or kind of ogle her photo a little bit. He also looks at most of her, kind of goes through the photos that are sitting on the table, and he says, you know, yeah, she's like a late bloomer, but look, she even kayaks, and she sees a picture of her kayaking, and then Gus starts to have a panic attack and starts to breathe deep and heavily, and he says, you know, um, why are you breathing? And Sean's like, why are you breathing so heavily? And Gus is like, it helps. I do this because cover a bunch of birthing classes or Lamaze classes, and doing this Lamaze class or being Lamaze classes, I've learned that breathing deep sort of levels out the anxiety. And Sean pretty much said, kind of makes fun of him and says, let me know when the contractions start happening. So Sean starts to look around the house, and kind of looks for clues, and finds out that she, through a painting or through a portrait that she has on the wall, where in the portrait she's kind of sitting next to a book written by Kurt Vonnegut, and he also finds out that she has other interests such as aviation. She's in aviation, and Gus says, or Sean says to Gus that this girl's spectacular. Meanwhile, Catherine McCollum, played by Priscilla Hutton, who you may know from, she played the nightclub girlfriend in Fantastic Four. She was in The Perfect Bride for Hallmark, my one and only for Hallmark. She was in episodes of Royal Pains. She was in an episode of Once Upon a Time, and her other films include Behemoth, Cats and Dogs 2, and Art of War 2 with Wesley Snipes from Blade. And she walks down the stairs and talks to Gus and Sean. Sean reassures her in sort of a kind of a flingy, kind of not flingy, but kind of hits on her in a way that says everything's gonna be okay. And she's like, "How sure are you?" And he says, "I have the most confidence that I'm sure." And she's like, "How sure? How should I trust you?" And he says, "Because I am a psychic." Asking her if she has a boyfriend, and he says, "Is it poignant?" And he's like, "Well, it very well might be." He says that, well, if it is any concern of yours, that I am seeing somebody, and he's kind of like, it's good, and you can tell by Sean's look that he was so hoping that she would say no, that she does not have a boyfriend. And then Sean tells her that he'll be in touch. So after interviewing Catalina, Sean and Gus start going through photographs, going through family albums, and then the sketch artist shows up to get the idea of who the kidnapper is gonna look like. So they tell the sketch artist that, kind of says, oh, more hair, and like so we see him giving details to the sketch artist to see what the guy looks like, and then the mom shows up behind Sean and screams that it's Bill, and she's like, Bill's, and the mom's like kind of frantic and saying, Bill's the kidnapper, and and Sean tries to calm everybody down and sort of uses his psychic ability to uh, uses psychic ability to basically uh, calm the situation. He reassures everybody that Bill is not the kidnapper, that he's just, in Sean's words, a horrible human being. And he kind of is trying to catch his steps by saying, "Who's Bill? Who's Bill?" I'm getting this sort of Bill character, and he starts, making up stuff that could make, Bill, or make stuff up that could kind of help him get out of what hole he's digging himself into. After sort of making a mockery of the police force, Sean and Gus walk out of the house, the McCollum's residence, and they see Mr. McCollum coming in, and Sean and Gus give him their condolences, and he says, Mr. McCollum, and he says, I'm Sean Spencer, the detective, the psychic, and Mr. McCollum says, if there's anything I can do, I'll be more than glad to help you guys. And he says, not, gives them their condolences that I can't. There's nothing that can, uh, set yourself up for any of this. And then Mr. McCollum just says, if there's anything at all, just call me anytime. And they say, we will, sir. Before Mr. McCollum can go into his house, Sean stops him and asks him one question about how his son felt about the dog. And Mr. McCollum says he loved that damn dog. He wouldn't do anything without him. And then he says, if there's anything else, just please call me. And Mr. McCollum walks in, but Sean then stops him. So he says, well, actually he didn't stop him, but he just kind of says, thank you for your time, and walks off. And then Gus is like, so you wanted to take time to ask him about his dog? And he says, basically he said, then Gus basically says, so what we've done so far is you've taken time just to hit on the victim's sister and accuse her boyfriend. And then Sean says that, Gus, don't worry about it. Everything's fine. And then Sean ends up going into digging through the McCollum's garbage. But Gus kind of says, you know what? I can't do this anymore. I quit, and gets in the car and starts to drive off. And Sean basically says, come on, get back here, while we see Gus pull out of the driveway, out of the entrance, and Sean's going to end up solving the case by himself. The next morning at about 6 a.m., Sean ends up breaking into Gus's house, and Gus wakes up thinking it's an intruder, as he should, and grabs a baseball bat and walks down the stairway into his kitchen, where he sees Sean happily drinking a cup of coffee and kind of going through and talking to Gus about the case and kind of things that he has already been sort of gathering clues up in his mind. Sean tries to get Gus back onto the case by saying, I, you want to know who kidnapped him? And Sean's like, no, or not. Gus is like, no, I don't want to produce perjury or anything like that. And Sean says nobody kidnapped him because he kidnapped himself. Then Sean goes into sort of his spiel about what he thinks is the motive of the crime. So he ends up telling Gus sort of the kind of what kind of the whole plot behind the kidnapping. So he says that Cameron didn't want, was just wanted didn't was hoping not to get cut off by his dad. So Sean and Gus going through photos of the Orson family, or of the McCollum family photos, sees that Sean tells Gus that Cameron had help through this man named Michael Orson. Malcolm Orson. With Malcolm Orson, who hasn't been seen for 18 months, and that he has been planning this whole kidnapping thing for at least a year. And so so Sean or Gus is pretty much like, this is really good information, and these are great photographs. Where'd you get all these photographs, Sean? And Sean says, Catalina McCollum's room. And she's like, and Gus is like, you didn't go into her room. And Gus or Sean's basically saying, look, I didn't go into the and I just wanted, and we kind of had lunch, and Gus is like, so wait, what are you guys doing? Are you guys dating? And Sean's like, no, we're not dating. We're not dating because it's not exclusive. And he says, come on, Gus, come on, we can do this. We can solve this case. And then we get to see, which I guess is a very much of a planned, usually a big thing that they have is, he says, why don't we slice this up on the way home while picking up a pineapple? And on the way to the scene, to picking up a pineapple. So they end up leaving and going. So they end up leaving Gus's house, and as they're driving, they drive a little bit too fast, and and then a police car that is looking for speedrunners ends up telling them and pulling them over. When the police officer pulls him over, Sean's like, look, I got this, and ends up giving him, when the police officer asks him for his license and registration, he ends up giving it. It's his dad's. He gets his dad's police not badge, but police card, and kind of tries to talk his way out of a ticket. And he says, Henry Spencer is your dad? And the police officer says, the patrolman says, played by Anthony Harrison, who's best known for the Mighty Ducks Game Changer television series. Exclusiva and Serenia, and Joe finds grace in 2017. But his name's Anthony, and he says, so Henry Spencer's your dad? And he's like, yep, he's can't be too careful living with a family of cops. And how's old Henry doing? And Sean basically says, oh, he's doing all right. He's retired and living in Florida. And he says, oh, is that so? And then the officer says, oh, is that so? The patrolman says, oh, is that so? And he says that I saw Henry a few weeks ago down at the Home Depot. And he says, and yeah, and he's like, yeah, my dad, he can be here and there anywhere. And then he says, tell him that the king fisherman says hello, and the officer doesn't give him the patrolman doesn't give him a ticket, and he ends up walking by, and he says, and so the officer lets him go without a ticket and says, tell your dad the king fisherman says hello. And this is interesting because we find out that Sean's dad is back in town. Bum, bum, bum. Well, and then so they head into the woods to sort of watch the lake view where young Malcolm and his family stay at the kind of like their cabin hotel or cabin in the at the lake and cabin at the lake. And as they're kind of spying, what I love is he Sean or Gus basically tells Sean, hey, where'd you get those binoculars? And he says, Sports Illustrated. I got it for from the magazine. It came with the magazine. And as they're looking around at the house, they see they think it's completely vacant, but they see the dog walking or running around the running around the yard. And then Gus gets this idea that says, let's call the police. And then, or no, better yet, let's call the chief, and just let them know what's going on. And Sean says, how about this? What if I have a vision and I lead them to the cabin? That might work. Then he starts basically saying, what kind of the details of the cabin. What about the red kayak, the yellow kayak, or the bullet holes in the signs? Why don't we just, bullet holes in the signs, and that'll kind of give us an alibi to tell the cops. So then, after they leave the cabin, they come up with a plan to talk to both Lassiter and his partner, where they're having lunch at a restaurant. As uh, they're walking into the restaurant, and he says, and they're like, come to the cabin. We're going to, their hat set. He's so focused on going to lunch that he basically blows them off and says, if you have any evidence, real evidence, please come back and talk to us. As they're walking by, Sean says, hey, detective. And, he holds his temple like he has a psychic vision and says, don't try the chicken. And he says, and he kind of scoffs and walks in to the restaurant and sits down and says, I'll have the chicken, extra chicken. And as he's ordering, Gus asked Sean, what was the whole point about talking about the chicken? And Sean tells him that one of the cooks, I think named Billy Camp, has one of the biggest hay fevers uh, known to man or something. He's very sick, and we see a guy coughing and sneezing in the back of uh, the in the kitchen, and Sean basically tells him that he's got the biggest hay fever, that that he's gonna make Lassiter sick. And what I also kind of like is when they sit down to eat, both Lassiter and Officer Barry sit down to eat, that they say you're worried that they're gonna take us as a couple. Meanwhile, as they're having lunch, Sean and Sean and Gus are watching them eat lunch, or watching them order and talk, and he says, "So what was that all about?" And Sean says, "Billy Hamer has one of the worst um, hay fevers ever," and we see that Billy Hamer is sneezing while cooking his food, which is completely gross. And Lassiter pretty much is looking over at the kitchen and sees the cook sneeze in front of his food, and Lassiter gets the point and ends up going to talk to um, Gus and Sean. So he kind of gets the memo and goes to see Gus and Sean and to kind of hear them out. So on a hunch, what's his name? Lassiter and Officer Barry take Gus and Sean up the mountains um, to the cabin to see what's going on. Basically, the spot where Sean and Gus were sort of spying on the cabin, and as they're looking through it, Lester takes Sean's binoculars, and Lester's like, "Are you sure about this?" And he says, "You know what? I'm not sure." Sean has a vision of of the dog and the bone, and as he's talking about this, Lassiter is looking through the binoculars and sees a dog running around, and Lassiter's like, "Oh my God, we need to call for backup." So he calls for backup. And what I like is you can tell that Sean pretty much knows that he sort of like got this one, and he's like, What do you see?" Meanwhile, the SWAT team shows up. And what I like is that Sean and Gus are walking with the SWAT team to kind of really show off their reward. And Sean is pretty much kind of thinking that this is going to be his big break, that they're going to get kind of famous, kind of get their detective agency up and running if they, solve this case, solve their cases, and how they're going to really kind of bring their brand to where it needs to be. So as they're walking as they're walking up the stairs into the cabin, they see, dun dun dun, they saw two men shot. One is shot in the stomach and one was shot in the head. And one is holding a gun, and he starts looking, and then Sean starts doing his psychic thing, and noticing there was a busted coffee cup, busted uh, coffee maker jug, and he also notices the gun and some fibers on the rest of the on the. Then Gus pretty much starts to have a panic attack and kind of excuses himself and says, "Ladies, gentlemen, thank you." And then he yells and runs out the room. Sean. So the next day, Sean and Gus are in the captain's office, kind of being congratulated that they solved the case and getting a check for their work on the case. And as they are working, as they get kind of are given the check and getting congratulated, Sean says, "You're making a big mistake. That this case isn't closed." Dun dun dun. Murder suicide angle. Sean doesn't buy, but that Captain Vic does buy, and she says that they had a falling out, that there was no ransom money, that Sean is pretty much, but also, he wants to get deeper into the case. Sean wants to get deeper into the case. Karen basically tells him that, you're not really a detective. I think this isn't really where you need to be at. And Sean needs to speak to the witnesses again. And Sean's like, this conversation is over. And so Gus is trying his best to kind of ease things out. So Sean sees Camden McCollum Sr. In one of the police offices, and Sean says, "You know what? I need to talk to this guy." And Gus is like, "No, you need to leave this alone." So Sean goes over to the office room where Chief McCollum, or Mr. McCollum is, and the but Officer Barry basically says Chief Callum wants to be left alone. And then Chief Callum said, or Chief Officer Vic says, leave Mr. McCallum alone. And so Sean kind of says, "Come on, let me get in there and still talk to him." Sean says something is going on and I want to know what it is. And then Lassiter basically stops him and says, "No, you're not going near Mr. McCollum in any shape or form." And he basically says, "In fact, I'm going to make it certain that you're not going to meet anyone, or I'm not going to let you anywhere around him." And Lassiter pretty much takes the fact that Sean is kind of stepping into his territory very seriously. And he says, "You think this is a game, but you think that this is just, real police work kind of thing. You're not a kid in a candy store." And I like what Sean says. He says, "I used to work in a candy store, and it's nothing like this." And then Lassiter says, "You're in over your head." And meanwhile, Sean is headed back to go to his dad's house to talk to him. While 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 he goes to see his dad says, "Well, I'm going to lunch. Why don't you come on with?" But before they go to lunch, we find out that Sean's parents are divorced and that Sean moved away to Santa Barbara and that his dad just recently moved back. So we can tell that there is some tension between them as of right now just looking at it through the pilot. But as watching the series as it uncovers, their relationship starts to get a little bit better as the series goes on. So anyway, they start to talk, and Sean and Henry says, "I'm about to go to lunch. Why don't you come join me?" And they head over to lunch. As they're at lunch, Henry pretty much says, there are when I was in the department, because we find out that we also know that he is a retired police officer. He says there were two things that I hated most: private investigators and psychics. And he says, "Son, you've kind of disappointed me because you are now both." And they start talking. And he also says that Sean basically has done this before. He's gone from job to job. It's kind of like the same thing. He says, you're gonna have a job for this for 6 months, and then all of a sudden you're gonna realize you wanted a job as a weatherman. And Sean's like, "It's not like that. It's not like that. I finally found my calling. That I finally found my gift." And he says, "You should have, that you made me this way," as we talked about at the beginning of the episode where Sean's dad showed him how to use his gift. And Sean's basically saying, "Look, I'm ready." He says, "I'm ready," and that I'm sure of this. And then they start discussing the case. And he says, "You know what? There was no ransom drop." And he says, a lot of, and Henry says, there's a lot of, the family gets scared that there's no, he says a lot of people, they try to scare the family. They try to do that and create panic in the family. And he was like, and then we kind of get sort of Sean's backstory according to his dad, that he's been saying, you've been driving your motorcycle all across the country, that you've been kind of become soft. And he says, "No way, not seven. Close your eyes. I'm not soft." And Sean, and then Henry Spencer says, "Close your eyes." And we basically see the same scene that we saw at the beginning. Saw the same scene that we saw at the beginning of the pilot, where he tells, Henry tells Hank to close his eyes, and he says, "I don't think so. I know that you're not cheating." So he closes his eyes and thinks that is kind of ridiculous. And then he basically asks him some kind of the questions like, how many hats are in the room? And he says, "Fine. Not including your hat that you're wearing, there are." Goes through how many hats are in the bar, and he names them all, except his dad says, "Sorry." So Henry basically says there was actually 7 hats, and he says, "No, there wasn't 7 hats." He says, "Yeah," and he says, well, there was one hat that cowboy hat that walked out before I closed my eyes. So you know what? I'm still good. I'm still fresh. That Sean's changed the rules, and he says, "Well, he didn't change the rules." He says, "You know what? I nailed it." Then Henry Spencer basically tells him, "You know what? You want to, if you really want to make me happy, why don't you go out into the real world, get a job, and in the meantime, you know, you know, who you trusting in this case? Is it world is money and thanks for lunch?" And then he gives him the total. So anyway, so meanwhile, Sean and Gus are doing a stakeout. McCollum's uh, meal at the business that the McCollums own. As they're looking through the stakeout, they see Caitlin McCollum and a guy named Bill walk out with a duffel bag that looks like a duffel bag full of money. Both, so they end up following them to a location. So they end up following her to the to a building where she just dropped off the bag at. And Sean and Gus are assuming that the bag is full of money. Sean sees her talking to the man that owned the laundromat or whatever the store is, and he starts to sneak and look, kind of get a chance to go out and grab the duffel bag. He does and makes a run for it. Tries to help, and they run into each other. Then Sean and Gus try to get into the car. Their car doesn't is locked, and Katrina is like, "What the hell is going on, Sean?" Thinks that it's a bag of money, but he opens up the bag and finds out it's just a bunch of clothes. So then find out that she was just donating clothes to a Goodwill station. And this kind of really, upsets Catalina. And so Sean and Gus are still staking out the Goodwill store. And so Sean asks Gus to go get the bag that's in the thrift store. So Gus goes in and sees the tall man in the baseball cap, also known as long hair, played by Christopher Hendrell, who is known for Peacemaker, Hell on Wheels, and Under the Banner of Heaven. Gus goes over and just sort of asks for the bag, and he even offers to pay for it. And this is basically used to stall Gus for Sean to get the bag. So Sean sneaks in on the other side and starts acting like he's looking for clothes. And as he's looking around at clothes, they end up having a tussle. Or they're not having a tussle, but Sean or Gus tries to keep long hair man from talking. He then uses the old "Who's that? Oh, look over there" gag, and the guy looks over, and Gus takes the chance, gives it to the chance for Sean to steal the bag. So Gus runs one way, Sean runs the other way, and the long-haired man chases Sean. As he's chasing Sean, he kind of runs and runs and runs and runs And then he gets into the car, and Gus drives away. And Gus is sort of, or Sean's kind of like, I can't believe you sold me out like that. So as they're driving away, it didn't have cash. It was actually empty, and they start looking through the bag. There's no money in it, and Gus or Sean asks Gus for some money, and he says, "Get your own money." He says, "Come on, Sean." Sean's just like, "Come on, Gus. I just need the money to look at for placement settings." So Sean says, "Okay," and gives him some money, and they line up the cash just to see how much money could be filled, if like $2 million could be filled in. And using denomination, they take out the money in each dollar bill, and he uh, puts the money in kind of not he takes a couple dollar bills and puts them around and says, depending on the denomination and kind of how big the dollar bill is, it could be easily he could easily put $10 million in that. Yeah, and Gus is like, really? He's like, yeah, give or take. And then Gus says, probably somebody tried, probably paid a ransom or even tried to. And Gus asks Sean, who is it? And he says, we're going to need something more than my psychic powers to figure this out. So then Sean goes and talks to Officer Barry, who is at her desk and is about to go home. And Officer Barry says, have nothing in common in that, fortunately, gut feelings are not a motive. And then Sean says, how about a motive? And he's, I live my life in a gray area. And she's like, well, it is a gray area, and says, well, we can't talk here. So Sean and Officer Lucinda Berry, they go to the shooting range or the firing range in the police station and end up having a conversation about the case. Dun dun dun. So Sean is looking over the case while Lieutenant Barry is at the firing range, and they talk about him and during the case, the gun having a modified muffler so no one could hear. But she says, you can hear him from a block away. And she says, you need a new target sheet. And she asks him if he needs a new target sheet to really show off his shooting power, or his handgun abilities. So then he says, how he kind of makes a joke that says so much lighter when they're filled with water. So he's got a pretty good shot, and he says, "Did I miss?" Or she says, "You missed." And he said, "Did I really?" And they bring up their target sheet, and Sean says, "Well, look at that. It's a perfect match." And she can't believe that he shot it that well. So Sean and Gus go to the McCollins residence once again for a final time. At that time, Camden McCallum Sr. comes in and says, "This is highly inappropriate. You shouldn't, the police have done all they want. You need to stay out of our way. Stay out of our way. We've gone through enough." and Sean says, but we'll find the right man. And Mr. McCollum says, well, who would the right man be? And Sean says, you. Mr. McCollum says, so you're saying that I killed my own son? And Sean's like, well, to be fair, I don't think you meant to. And Sean's like, or Mr. McCollum's like, you're not even a cop. And he says, well, I can see. Then he starts to tell this, to kind of have a psychic vision, and basically tell the story of how his case is going to work. Basically, that how Mr. McCallum did the crime, where he went to the cabin and basically killed Camden, his son, and he made the. He was gonna just kind of knock him around and not even kill him, but then to teach him a lesson. So he throws, and we kind of see him throw him up against the wall and throw him down, and he hits his head. Camden McCallum Jr. hits his head on the counter of the table and ends up falling. And then Orso, the other one, shows up or comes in and sees Camden McCallum Sr. Doing the kind of having the fight, and Orson comes in, pulls out his gun, and they have a tussle, getting Orson's gun and telling him and throwing him in the chair, or not throwing him in the chair, but tossing the chair with his hands up. Orson comment sees McCallum Jr. on the ground, and he shoots Orson and tries to make it look like it was a suicide. He comes home to inform the police that they're gonna wait for a ransom to come, and police show up, but it's easy to look shaken while the ransom is going on. And Orson basically, or McCallum Sr. says, you have a really overactive imagination. You can't really pin this on me. Then Sean says, after 18 months ago, his son, Cameron McCallum Jr. came to see Cameron McCallum Sr. about that he's kind of cleaning up his act, that he's done, that he's doing a fresh start. And he says that. And he says he's going to change himself around. And then his son duped him. So Mr. McCallum starts to threaten Sean. And Gus comes in and says, come on, Sean, we're going. And McCallum says, I'll be back. And Sean says, I'll be back. McCallum says, you won't. And they start walking out, and Sean's like, I almost had him. Why'd you stop us? And he says, and Gus says, it wasn't the right tact. And he says, Compsamine is for dog bites. I have some samples, because Gus kind of realizes that Mr. McCallum's injuries were based on a dog bite. He had a dog bite, and that he had the medicine for it to clear it up and why he was wearing a long sleeve shirt in the heat, that he was covering up a dog bite. And then Sean says that dog did have blood on his teeth. So then Sean and Gus get into their car, and as they're getting in the car, Sean decides to call the police, and Gus is like, "Why are you calling the police on Mr. on Comrade McCollum Sr.?" He says, "No, Gus, I'm not calling them on him. I'm calling them on us." And so he wants to make the police come to sort of show him that and to kind of make him sound like Comrade to call the police on them. So the police end up showing up, and Comrade is like, "It's about time." Police on them. Both Sean and Gus get arrested, and Gus is like, "Anytime, Sean, you want to tell them that we've gotten through." And Sean says, "Nope, not yet, not yet." And as they're walking, and Sean's kind of like, or Gus is like, "We're going to go to city jail in a sec." And so as he's getting in the car, when Lassiter is about to put him in the car, Sean starts to have his psychic tantrum, should I say, and say that, you should check the left leg. Check the left leg. There's something about the left leg or right leg, one of the two. And, I think it's a dog bite. And Mr. McCollum is like, "This is absurd. No one would believe me. This is not going to happen. You're not going to take a look at my leg." And then the captain says, why not we check the right leg?" And so as Sean's kind of like, doing his spiel about the leg, she says, "Why don't we check the leg?" And as they end up checking the leg, they find that Mr. McCallum he says, "Why don't you just check the wrist? Check the wrist. Check the wrist." And Mr. McCollum is like, "This is outrageous. This is you're not going to find anything, that this is complete. This is a complete witch hunt." And he's like, "You really," and then Mr. McCollum's like, "You're really going to believe some psychic over me?" And she says, and he says, "I could do," and then Karen says, "I can do this now, or I can call in a warrant." And I'll be right here. And so he starts. Then Sean's, as he's getting into the in the car, he's like, "I see a doctor. I see a doctor. Interpret Dolly. Consamine." And then he starts yelling about he sees the vision of the dog bites, or the medicine that treats dog bites. Sean starts saying, "Check the wound, check the wound, check the wound." And then that's when Mr. McCollum gives up and says, "It was an accident. I didn't mean for it to happen." And he ends up getting arrested. Solved the case, and Sean goes back to the police station the next day, and he sees Captain Vic and his father, talking, and they talk about basically Sean, Captain Vic and Henry. Henry's giving Catherine Vic a background check on Sean, and Sean says there's a check for, and then so they walk by um, and he said, and she basically gives him a job, saying there's a check in the cage, and that sign for it and come back in because there's another case you're gonna solve. Chop block in Sutherland. So anyway, as he gets the case, Sean runs out of the police station to his father and says, Dad, thanks a lot for giving me this job. And I've already got another case. And Henry says, this is the last time I'm going to cover for you. And they say, Sean's dad is pretty much not okay with you being a psychic detective, but that Henry isn't really okay with it, and Sean's kind of expects him not to be okay with it. And then the next day, Sean and Gus go to their office, or finally find their office, and Sean names the detective agency PSYCH, and they sort of are going to start doing more, solving more crimes and helping more people out. Sean has basically, and Gus have now become psychic detective, or become part of a psychic, become now part of a detective company. And they're going to have to make money for 6 months so they can get the building keep going. Says, and Sean basically tells Gus that there are more cases to be solved, including the case where a car thief got poisoned by his boss. And that's the episode of the first episode of Psych. So here are my thoughts on it. I like this episode. I mean, there was a lot of detail in the episode about sort of, we had to figure out how Psych started, or how Sean has the gift. And I liked the relationship between him and his dad, Corbin Burrowstone. I think the acting works. I especially think both Dule Hill and James Rhodey are, how their relationship is. I like how Corbin Benston is a great character. Timothy Olyphant. They're great actors. I'm really kind of interested in kind of seeing kind of where I can kind of see where they're pedaling, kind of they're finding their feet in the first pilot. I can kind of, and I've seen a couple episodes in season one. I mean, I think once you get to episode 10 or 11 of season one, that's really, they start to find the stride. But it's a pretty good, solid episode for us. I give it a 8.5 out of 10. And I think it's a pretty decent show. I mean, the show really works because I think both James Rhodey, like I said, the cast is great. So that's my review of Psych. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you like what you hear, hit the like and subscribe button. Peace. Bye.